Russia is losing the war in Ukraine, says a former senior US diplomat. In today's interview, I'm honored to be joined by Ambassador James Gilmore, who explains the broader consequences of Russia's actions and what's at stake if the international community fails to push back against Putin's aggressive, imperialist, and expansionist ambitions. As a Trump era diplomat, James Gilmore has had first hand experience of negotiating with the US's European partners and our common Russian foe. James Gilmore was the former US ambassador to the OSCE during the first administration of President-elect Donald Trump. A member of the Republican Party, Gilmore also chaired the Republican National Committee in 2001 and served as the US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe during the first Trump administration and the implementation, of course, of the Minsk Accords. In 1997, James Gilmore was elected as governor of Virginia with a majority of 56%, where improvements to education quality and teacher numbers formed one of his key manifesto policies. Well, welcome to the channel, James. I am deeply honored and actually thrilled by this conversation.
Thank you for the chance to be here with your viewers.
You are a staunch supporter of Ukraine's fight for sovereignty, even at times when it wasn't fashionable and where the survival of Ukraine was in doubt. What is the source of your passion on this issue?
Well, the American national interest is the key source of my concern about this. I'm very worried about the ongoing hybrid war that we're all involved in here in the 21st century as a result of the Putin aggression and also the Chinese involvement, Iran and North Korea. I think that the Western world, led by the United States, is under attack right now with a hybrid war. American leadership is under attack. And I believe that it is in the American national interest for Ukraine to stop Putin now before we end up in a general military world war. I would like to avert that war. I would like that to never happen. And I believe that it can still be averted, despite the fact that we're a little late in the game, as long as America exercises decisive leadership. To repeat, I think that the Ukraine victory in the Ukraine war by Ukraine is in the American national interest, and that is what is motivating me.
And there's a fascinating comment from one of your recent interviews. You said that you've had extensive interaction with Russian diplomats. Sometimes that's been cordial. Obviously, under the current circumstances, it's going to be less so. But interestingly, you say there that you never forgot who you were speaking to. The fact that many, if not all of them, would have gone through sort of KGB training, whatever that involves. I think we have an idea that it's not particularly grounding in the humanities in the Western sense. So, what is your impression of Russian diplomats? There's only been one who has defected during this entire war. Who are they, and why are they so aligned with the regime in what seems to be an incredibly wasteful and pointless war?
Well, there are two questions. It won't be pointless unless Putin loses. If Putin wins, there's quite a point to it. But to answer your questions, I don't want to overstate the discussions and negotiations I had with my Russian colleagues in Vienna at the OSCE. There was not a lot of heavy discussion going on at that time. I only really introduced bilateral discussions with myself and my staff and the Russians and their staff rather late in my experience at OSCE. But what you do get is constant interaction, particularly formally, in the weekly Thursday meetings of the Permanent Council, where all 57 ambassadors at OSCE show up and are prepared to issue any statement that their country wants to state. As a practical matter, what you always saw in those meetings was statements by the United States and Ukraine, and then usually a response by Russia. And then offline, I had an opportunity to get to know the Russian ambassador and the Russian staff, and I liked them actually personally very much. But the point is that ambassadors represent their country. That ambassador was quite loyal to the Russian Federation, and he represented his country's interests, and I always understood that. But that didn't stop us from having a cordial relationship, so that if the opportunity presented itself to further our bilateral relations, that channel of communication and that friendliness would be there. So that is the range of it. Why are they doing what they're doing? Well, first of all, the ambassadors and their staff, and I'm sure they were KGB people or FSB people now. I'm sure they were. they have a duty officially to support their country, and I'm sure emotionally they support their country. Russians are very loyal to their country. And so that has to be taken into consideration, particularly when you see that country behaving in complete wrongdoing, which is what they're doing right now. Conquest, atrocity, stealing of children, kidnapping of children, murder, rape, an effort to conquer an independent nation, which they do not even acknowledge to be an independent nation. Although I met with the Ukrainian ambassador every week personally, offline to have conversations. I know they're an independent country. I visited them in 2021 personally. After I left the ambassadorship, I met with about 12 cabinet ministers. I understand that they are an independent country and do not want to be part of the Russian Federation. So that's, I think, the source of their resistance and why I believe the United States should be supporting them.
And if we take your words there, it suggests that peace on Putin's terms is incompatible with a sovereign, independent, and secure Ukraine. Is that a fair statement? And how do we prevent peace on Putin's terms from becoming the reality?
Well, again, two questions. First, I believe that peace on Putin's terms is against the American national interest. What you see there is a demand by Putin that he continue his program of conquest in Europe. And I'm very concerned about that. And I think if he prevails in Ukraine, that program of conquest is underway and will be made worse as time goes on, and eventually will require the West, including the United States, to respond. And I don't want to see that eventuality occur because that would be quite late in the game, and very dangerous to the entire planet. So, what is Putin's demand? He demands well, frankly, I think that it's perfectly clear that he doesn't think that Ukraine is a country at all. So his goal of this war is to reduce Ukraine into being a vassal state or no state at all, maybe just a province of Russia, the way that it was under the Stalinist period. We know that the Russians today celebrate Stalin and his conquest and his behavior, which is, of course, absolutely contrary to the interests of the United States. He wants that. He also wants to ensure that Ukraine would never join NATO. Well, frankly, Jonathan, when I was ambassador in Vienna, there was no discussion of Ukraine joining NATO at that time. There really wasn't. But once the Putin triggered the war, and the requests and entreaties of Ukraine became more intense because of that. I think now the issue of Ukrainian membership in NATO is up on the table, where it wasn't before, generated by the Putin aggression. But the point is that at OSCE, one of the principles of OSCE is that an element of sovereignty of any country is its ability to join any type of organization that it wants to. And Ukraine wants to be a part of the European Union. They want to move west. They want to be part of NATO. They do not want to be part or have any part of this Russian aggressive, authoritarian atrocity regime in Moscow. And they don't have to be. They shouldn't have to be. That's really what is at work here. They're going to want to have relief from all their sanctions, which will then increase their national power and enable them to then move on beyond Ukraine. These things are not something the United States should want to see come to pass. This is the moment when Putin can be beaten back, and he should be.
I don't mean to be partisan in the next question, but it seems we could characterize the last few years of US policy under Biden and Sullivan. Escalation management is the term that's been used, but essentially, I believe that it's through the sort of coercive threats of nuclear blackmail has self-deterred the West from really supporting Ukraine to the maximum degree. If that policy can be said to have failed, because clearly Putin has not been deterred, and indeed he's doubling down on aggression, he's introduced North Korean troops and equipment into the arena as well, and he seems to be wanting to widen the conflict. If we assume escalation management is a failure, then what alternative policy is required to bring Putin to the table and to negotiate, if not in good faith, but under a position of weakness, not the position of strength, which I think he perceives he has at this point?
Well, I'm skeptical that a negotiation, whether it's strong or weak, is the right policy to be following at all. Because I don't think Putin is going to be negotiating in good faith. He's invested now for years, 750,000 of his citizens who are wounded or dead. He's never really deviated from his plan, and I don't believe there's any chance that he's going to deviate. And his positions that he's put forward for so-called settlement remind us of that. So I don't believe that Russia has been deterred at all by this nuclear issue. I think the United States has been deterred. I think that when Putin threatened a nuclear war, I think that it frightened President Biden. And as a result, I think he has been very slow in his support to Ukraine, sometimes critically slow, and retarded the Ukrainians' ability to respond and push back against Putin until the Russians had time to dig in and put their defenses into position. I think that policy of President Biden has frankly exacerbated this. I think it's a slow motion surrender. Now, the other thing that you want to talk about, of course, is the policy of President Trump. Let me hasten to say that I don't know yet what that policy is going to be. I've heard President Trump make statements that are pretty derogatory towards Ukraine. I've heard Vice President Vance make those statements as well. But in the end, President Trump is a stronger individual and is not likely to be either deterred or intimidated by Vladimir Putin. He has a tendency to believe that his personal diplomacy can resolve some of these issues. I don't believe that's the case in this instance because I've watched Putin. And I think that he is delusional in that he believes that he can, in fact, reverse history and reestablish the Russian Empire. I don't think he can, but he has the potential of committing great damage between now and the time that reality sets in, or he is removed from the leadership of Russia.
And in recent interviews, you've talked compellingly about the economic fragility of the Russian situation. One of the things that perhaps could have been done faster, but does seem to be working, are some of the sanctions at least. In that respect, does Putin even want peace? Does he need peace? Because surely there could be an existential threat to his regime of peace, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers coming back who've seen the reality on the front. This could pose a huge risk to his regime, and he's retooled his economy into a war economy. There's propagandists and oligarchs who are dependent on the largesse and the graft that's coming out of this war machine. It could all fall apart if peace breaks out. So do you share that view?
Well, I do believe that the sanctions are beginning to actually make a difference. Inflation reportedly, and again, I don't have any intelligence information. And let me be clear with your viewers, I do not speak for the Trump administration. But my own view is that, based on the reports, is that we have to pay attention to the increased inflation in Russia, which is dramatic, to the fact that their economy is not really developing in any civilized type of way, in any sort of balanced way. They're still basically extracting natural resources and selling it, and that's how they're running their economy. I think that the loss of their soldiers is severe. While they're making progress in Ukraine, to be sure, they're paying for it in the blood of their soldiers, even the North Korean soldiers. Imagine North Korean soldiers fighting in Europe. It's almost unbelievable. And I think they're dying in large numbers. And so I think that that's something that we need to see at this point, that there are cracks and strains in Russia. If I were Vladimir Putin, I would be dying to have a negotiation. I would really want to have a ceasefire so that he can stop some of the bleeding from Russia. Now, this is not to say that he's not inflicting terrible damage on Ukraine. He is. But the Ukrainians, I think, as a people, understand their situation. If they surrender or are conquered, their entire leadership is murdered. Their people are reduced to basically vassal servitude. They've had that experience. They know their history, and they don't want to be any part of it. So I think that they will fight on for quite a long time. Meanwhile, Russia is bleeding, and I think that Putin should want a ceasefire. I'm not sure that it's in the Western interest to give him a ceasefire.
And you've mentioned earlier in this interview and in other interviews as well that there is a strain of isolationism in US history, and that has usually been sort of overcome. We saw that overcome in the Second World War, and really the 20th century become the American century, following that change of policy to enter the war on the Allied side. What are the risks here, though, of exceptionalism, nativism? And again, it's a double-barrel question, I'm afraid. We're also getting these curious signals coming out of the Trump regime. And I see this very much as sort of marketing, throwing spaghetti against the wall. But these conversations about Canada, Greenland, that's not isolationist. That's a form of expansionism, almost imperialism. I don't necessarily believe they're going to carry that out. But you've got this strange kind of mixed set of signals that are coming out. What are the risks to Ukraine of these different sort of strains that we are hearing about?
Well, just a propaganda danger to Ukraine. If the United States became aggressive with respect to Greenland or something like that, then Putin could just simply say, "Sure, you're doing this with Greenland, I'm doing it with Ukraine. It's all the same thing." So that would be a risk of all of this. But I think that President Trump has, his dramatic and bold initiatives should be taken seriously. It's not that America wants to conquer Denmark's territory or should want to do that. But let's face it, with the thawing that's going on in the Arctic, Greenland is a strategic place. America has one of their very large base in Greenland. It's a friendly group. But what I didn't know was that they're semi-autonomous, that they govern themselves, what their population is, which is about 60,000, that there's tensions with the home country of Denmark. They really don't want to be told what to do by Denmark. These are all things that I never knew until President Trump raised the issue. But I think that's going to keep on going, and the discussion will continue to go forward as America seeks to protect its national interests. But um, I think you should separate all that talk out from the Ukrainian war. I think they have to be dealt with separately. The potential advancement of America's national interest in the Western Hemisphere is different from this war that's going on caused by Russia in the Eastern Hemisphere. So I think that they have to be dealt with separately. Uh, just a word about American isolationism. It's gotten a lot of play in the American media and the worldwide media because it's so exotic. This is really different. And as a result, it's, I think, exaggerated. But I take it seriously because of things that our national leaders have been saying. But I believe let me state my case clearly. I believe that the United States is served by having alliances. I believe the United States is served by having decisive presidential leadership. I believe that the United States national security is tied up with stopping Russian aggression. And I'll tell you why. Because if Russia prevails in Ukraine, it's not only the first step towards military conquest in places like Moldova, in places like the Baltic countries in particular, right on their border, right on their same continent border, but also Eastern Europe at that point will become very concerned, I believe. I have experience with dealing all of the ambassadors. They are allies of the United States. They are friends of the United States. They are responsive to United States leadership. The Eastern Europeans are well aware of their history under Soviet rule, and they don't want to go back to that. All this is true. But if the United States should withdraw to itself, then I think that there would be some risk there that the politics of Eastern and Western Europe would be altered and not in the American national interest. Therefore, I see this Ukraine war as pivotal to the future of the country and indeed of the world because of the goals that I see globally by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea.
And there's two things that might surprise my audience here, but these are things that Trump has said in his first term, which actually broadly now seem rather sensible. One was talking about the strategic risks of Nord Stream. And of course, that's passed, but in hindsight, that was very prescient. The other one, of course, is the conversation around Europe not paying its way. And again, at the time, we could see a lot of pushback. Now it seems the idea of at least going up to 3.5% of GDP on defense, to many of us seems very sensible. And these are people I speak to on the left, the center, and the right of the spectrum, political spectrum in the UK. But unfortunately, Europe and the UK seem to be hitting snooze on their alarm clock every time there's a crisis. We just don't seem to be able to wake out of this slumber and take responsibility for our own defense.
Yes, and in conferences that I've been in just in recent days, the reports that I'm getting out of Europe is that the European leadership still has not awakened to the danger of China. Russia is the immediate problem because of the war that was triggered in Ukraine by Putin, unwisely. I think it was a mistake. As of course I've said, it isn't a mistake unless he loses. But that being said, the Europeans, I think, still seem to be very much involved with their commerce with China. They seem to continue to use the rhetoric that China is a competitor. I believe the Western world should abolish the word competitor from their vocabulary. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are not competitors. They are adversaries. That's, by the way, not by our choice. I think the Europeans wish that they would just be a competitor in economics and so on, but they're not. They're adversaries by their choice. And there's nothing that we can do but confront their policy of hybrid war against the West. The reality is all of that. Now, to address the point, once again, President Trump is right. We're not going to be able to engage in this global conflict for the future of the 21st century alone, the United States. We're going to have allies, in my view. That is my experience in Vienna as ambassador at OSCE. And I admired very much the representatives of those countries and the policies of those countries to stick with the West and do the right thing. But they've got to be enabled to do it. So sooner or later, their political leadership is going to have to awaken their publics in Europe that a sacrifice economically is going to have to be made, and the defense and the expenditures are going to have to be greater. And not just in terms of just dollars or pounds or euros. It's going to have to be in terms of the quality of the rearmament that's going to be necessary. But we simply cannot go on for decades with Europe and the West believing it's living in a bubble where they can be safe and happy and go about their daily lives while our adversaries are arming to the teeth and engaging today in a hybrid war in reality.
And we've just got a couple of questions left, but because of your OSCE experience, I really wanted to dig into that before we sort of round up with another geopolitical question. If there was some kind of negotiation and if the lines of contact were frozen, albeit without Ukraine, recognizing any transfer of sovereign territory, we're back in the kind of Minsk kind of period, aren't we? And then role of OSCE becomes important to sort of monitor. What's your experience out of that? Because in speaking, I've interviewed a couple of people who are actually monitoring that ceasefire, and they said that essentially Russia lies. They're lobbing artillery shells over and then blaming the Ukrainians for it. And this is happening on a daily basis. The lies, the myths, the gaslighting. And recently, Vladislav Surkov, who's the architect really on the Russian side of these Minsk Accords, he's come out and blatantly admitted that this was a ruse, that this was distraction. They had no intention whatsoever of finishing hostilities. In fact, this was a convenient cover to carry on arming and planning for further attacks on Ukraine. So what's the role of OSCE and how do we avoid falling into the sort of Minsk trap?
Well, when I was ambassador, the Minsk agreements were under constant discussion, particularly since there basically was sort of a frozen border at that time, with Russian proxies being in charge of the eastern provinces and the rest of Ukraine not agreeing that they were losing that territory. OSCE monitors were in eastern Ukraine at that time, and that was a real challenge. But the main point here, I think, is to understand what the Minsk agreements were. They were put into place with Ukraine being at the point of a gun in 2014. They were a decent agreement, though. The Russians never deviated, and this is a very important lesson for your viewers. Look and see what the national goals of Russia are, and then judge everything that they do or we do based upon that, what their intentions are. Their intentions are not simply to conquer the eastern provinces of Ukraine and go home. that's not worthy of 750,000 dead and wounded Russian people. Their ambitions are much more global, combined with that of China, Iran, and North Korea. And the battle here today is for the future of the 21st century. But to turn back to the Minsk agreements, the goal of Russia was always to use the Minsk agreements in order to certify their conquests. And the goal of Ukraine was to not allow that to happen unless there was a legitimate referendum in the eastern provinces, unmitigated by Russian influence, FSB, soldiers. And those two parties never came together under the Minsk agreements, which, by the way, America was not a party to those negotiations. But I was very close with my French and British and German compatriots who were a part of that discussion, and I understood day by day what was going on there. But the main point that I wanted to make to your viewers is this: what's at stake right now is the future of the world under the 21st century. Are we going to live in a world where conquest and force and atrocity and war crimes, authoritarianism, totalitarianism becomes the order of the day, or not? Is Ukraine going to survive as an independent country, or isn't it? Is Israel going to survive as an independent country, or isn't it? These are the things that the aggressors now are putting up on the table, and there's actual a battlefield going on right now, not to mention the hybrid war of cyber attacks, cables being cut, and most important of all, messaging, the propaganda war that's underway right now, which works on the minds of the people in the West who are more vulnerable to this than the people in the East, because we're an open society and we hear things like your podcast. So we're subject to that kind of disinformation and propaganda in a way that the Russian people are not. So this war is going on right now. It's underway. And my message to your viewers is wake up. This is not a time when we can be passive and relaxed. Our leadership of all of our Western countries has got to understand the conflict that we are in fact in and what the stakes are for the 21st century.
And of course, countries that understand the risk and the threat, which perhaps Western Europe hasn't woken up to, Poland, Ukraine, they're starting to talk about the acquisition of nuclear weapons. So one of the outcomes of this uncertainty and aggression we're seeing from large totalitarian blocs or alliances will almost certainly be a proliferation of nuclear deterrence. Do you think that's almost inevitable now?
Well, I hope not. The policy of the world in earlier days has been to stop nuclear proliferation, but it's leaking. It leaked in North Korea. It is now Iran's policy, in my view, to obtain those weapons. Israel has said that they will not obtain those weapons. So that is definitely a war point in the Middle East right now that is not yet launched. I think it's a bad idea for more countries in the world to have nuclear weapons, because the political instability of the world in the 21st century is such that there's always a grave risk that there will at least be battlefield nukes used as opposed to ballistic missiles. But never forget that we are in a situation today where we're going to have to run some risk in order to prevail in the 21st century. As a child of the Cold War, I understand this. All the Western countries accepted this risk during the Cold War. The United States did, Britain did. We all accepted the risk that nuclear conflict was possible and that the deterrence was the policy to prevent it from happening. Soviet leadership understood this clearly. And there was a time of stability, even though the Soviet Union was a dreadful, malign influence in the world. It ceased a lot of its attempts to conquer because they understood the danger. I think Vladimir Putin is delusional, and I think he does not understand the danger, although so far this combination of China and Russia has not tried to trigger those weapons, Biden notwithstanding. And I hope that we can weave our way along here to a world that's still free, that does not fear the knock on the door in the middle of the night, that can be open, and that people can live a decent political free life, free from this aggression that we're facing right now. But it's going to require decisive leadership in the days ahead.
And that leads to the very last question, and that is that Putin, I think, and reading, listening to Russian sources who've mentioned this a number of times, opposition sources, Putin seems to be dreaming of having a Yalta conference of tyrants. He seems to be dreaming of this moment when he can start working with other autocrats to carve up the world and create a new way of running the world as well through informal power and all the stuff we know that he prizes. What are your fears that Trump might be sort of persuaded or coerced into actually participating in such an event? And of course, it's almost implicit in this that Ukraine would be precluded from those negotiations and from setting those conditions of peace. What's the risk of that?
Well, I've written articles in the past saying there should certainly not be a new Yalta. There should not be a division in the world. For one thing, America has a sort of a dual foreign policy. We certainly always are trying to protect the American national interests, and by the way, protecting our allies is protecting the American national interest, as long as they are full participants. The American taxpayer will not tolerate our allies free riding on America. And that's part of what is going on in American politics today, a sense that that's going on. That will not be tolerated. So our allies are going to have to awaken to the fact that they have to carry their end of the log. But that being said, I want to be clear about this. I don't know what President Trump's policy will be. I think that we can judge the language, but the fact is that there are two things that I put my hope into. One is that President Trump is a stronger personality. I don't think he's going to allow himself to be pushed around by Putin or by anybody else, number one. And number two, I think that history is pretty positive. Remember when this whole thing began to emerge back in 2014 and beyond, President Obama was sending rations to the Ukrainians. The first real military assistance of Javelin missiles was sent by President Trump. So I believe that President Trump is certainly not a weak individual, and I'm hopeful and optimistic that he will come to understand all of these national interests of the United States and our allies, because frankly, the war is right there in front of us. It's not hidden. We can see it. But this is a new administration that certainly wants to make sure that U.S. interests are protected. But the rest of the world, of course, should live free, in my view, from this totalitarian threat. And only the United States has the weight, the population, the sophistication, the technology to be able to lead our allies and together with them protect the Western world from this kind of dim future that could emerge.
James, Ambassador Gilmore, it's been such a huge pleasure speaking to you, and it's refreshing to hear the sort of clarity of vision and moral clarity that you have explained to us today. I think this is a very important conversation, and I hope it reaches a large audience. For now, thank you so much for coming onto the channel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.